I'd like to give a special thanks to Global for their generous support of this program.
Uh, well, it's not headsets and goggles. We need to understand what's happening today. But let's start with the data, because their brains are just so overloaded. We're looking then at the uncertainties about the future we cannot know. I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? So what's the actual lived experience? The pandemic really reset our social centers, but that's not really how work happens right now. What does the future of culture look like? It's about socialization of process. Our clients need to be able to pre-experience what that final product looks like. What's the actual measurable KPIs to help us understand what's possible? And that really generates then multiple futures. And that's really what Foresight is. It's about preparation. It's not about prediction. So it really allows us to reinvent not just the design process, but the relationship that we have with our client, hopefully as a mechanism to help our industry retain its relevance. People will just get overwhelmed, and then they're just going to default to what it is that they already know. A lot of times, the failure that I see with new designs and places and products is not because they didn't create something new and innovative, it's because they didn't socialize it well.
What if we could look into a crystal ball and design the workplace of the future? What would we see? Or are things too confused, hazy, and uncertain for us to determine what is next, and will it be shaped by forces we can't yet see coming? Welcome to What the F is Happening to the Office, the show where we explore how work, the workplace, and the world around it are evolving. Hi, I'm Bob Fox, founder of Work Design, and in each episode, we talk with the experts shaping the future of work about what's driving change and what that means for all of us. Today, I'm excited to welcome Mark Bryan, Chief Research and Strategy Officer at the International Interior Design Association. Mark leads global research, foresight, and strategic intelligence. He helps the built environment community understand what's coming next and how to prepare for it. He also directs IIDA Futures, IIDA's platform for applied foresight and future-focused education, and leads the Certified Design Futures program, building foresight capacity across our industry. Mark has spent his career translating signals of change into practical insights. He brings a unique mix of design research, foresight thinking, and hands-on experience with trends shaping our world, from AI and immersive technology to health, well-being, and the changing social fabric of work itself. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you so much for having me. I have been very excited about this conversation and looking forward to diving in all things future and work.
And likewise here, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation just with all the change that's taking place around us. Before we dive in, tell us a little bit about your background and the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, so I started my career in design. I worked on projects of all sizes and shapes and sectors, including workplace. And I did everything from the research and the concept all the way through construction administration. So very, very familiar with the design process. And I did that for about 20 years. And towards the later part of that career, I really noticed that my clients were getting stuck. I feel like we've all been in those meetings where the client hesitates or, they're excited about the design, but then they ask you that question of what's the actual lived experience once this project is done? Not just the benefits of like a collision zone or the social cafe, but like what's the actual measurable KPIs or key performance indicators that I can expect? And so realizing this, I realized that our clients need to be able to pre-experience what that final product looks like, more than just a rendering, more than just a video. And so I was very fortunate to have run into some professional futurists. And so I went and was trained in strategic foresight. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with strategic foresight, it's a data-driven practice. It's not just about thinking ahead, but it's about really using the data and understanding how we can explore where the world is going, where value is going to be created, and how firms, organizations, leaders, and anybody really should participate in that future. And so I brought that back to the firm that I was working for. and stood it up as a practice, and was very fortunate to get to work on some really great projects that talked about what does the future of culture look like in a workplace? What does the new services look like for a Habitat for Humanity that they could provide meaning to the people that they serve over the next 10 years? And so uh, I found so much joy in doing that. I then moved on to do that for a full time consultancy firm. So I did that for 3 years, where I focused on the built environment and consumer product group, supply chain, hospitality, logistics, manufacturing, furniture companies, really, and even toy manufacturers, to help them understand and answer those questions about where the world is going, where is new value going to be created, and where can they play. So I did that for 3 years, and then really wanted to come back truly into the built environment. And so was very fortunate in working with the International Interior Design Association, or IIDA, to be able to come in as of December 1st of 2025 to serve as their first Chief Research and Strategy Officer. And so, as you said, now I lead IIDA Futures as part of that, which is really about taking what IIDA has already started champion, which is foresight in the built environment and in design, and creating new insights, being able to generate new types of reports and certifications and skills that will really help augment and elevate the built environment practice to help keep it ready for those changes that sometimes feel a little hard to articulate or to understand or to even address, and really use that uncertainty to allow us to move forward versus a lot just keeping us where we are today. And so that is where I am now.
It sounds like you're having a lot of fun.
I really am. I have a very deep love and passion for the built environment. I grew up, my dad used to run hospitals. And the thing that really spurred me on to become a designer is I remember he was working on a hospital addition. They were doing a new lobby entrance space. And I remember walking in when the drywall had just gone up and just imagining what that meant for the people who were going to come in and experience that space and feel the new types of care that were going to be provided. And I think that's what a lot of people do and what a lot of people resonate with when they create spaces and products. And even in Foresight, that's what I'm doing now, that imagining of what could be. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'm really excited about what the future can bring in this new role.
Is there a certain type of data or patterns that you look for to be able to pluck things that are going to indicate to you what's coming down the road?
There's really two types of data that we're trying to look for. Really, I should say data and insights. So in Foresight, first and foremost, we need to understand what's happening today. And so when I'm going and doing research, I'm looking at both published and unpublished white papers. I'm looking at patent filings. I'm looking at what new startups are coming into the market. I'm looking at, what is the data actually telling us about utilization or about productivity. So I'm looking for the true data, not the news articles, but the true data of what is happening in the world today. And then there are specific frameworks that we use in Foresight to help us to analyze and to really qualify trends based off of that data. So that's one part. The other part, and I was saying more insights, is we're looking then at the uncertainties about the future we cannot know. So based off of that data, based off of what we are looking and seeing today, what are the things that we just don't know and how it's going to evolve? For example, workplace. We don't know necessarily what some of these new technologies are going to do to the workplace and how they may change how people work. So when I'm looking at creating, scenarios for the future or creating ideas about what may be, I'm using the data to act as a basis. So that's the layer that we use to make sure that we're grounded. And then I'm using the uncertainties and the insights that come from really merging all that together to help us understand what's possible. And that really generates then multiple futures, where then that goes back to analyzing what are the common red threads across whichever future evolves, so that way we're prepared. And that's really what foresight is. It's about preparation. It's not about prediction. It's about making sure that we're prepared for multiple eventualities, because I think sometimes we get caught off guard with things like, I don't know, a pandemic that may really disrupt us. And I think we've all felt that disruption. And I think that's why a lot of people are turning to foresight today as a tool, as a new skill set that they want to incorporate, and hopefully as a mechanism to help our industry retain its relevance.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask is when a black swan comes, how do you deal with that? Because it's got to be coming like the complete surprise.
I feel like we're almost in this age of acceleration where everything's coming at us faster and faster and faster. And so, yes, sometimes those black swan events come at us. Sometimes it's just a behavioral change, and that sometimes could come from a new device or a social media trend. And we have to be prepared for some of those eventualities. Not saying you're going to be prepared for every single social media trend, but how social media trends could start to create almost that swell of behavioral changes. So it's really about saying, okay, if some of these things occur, here are the steps that we would take to be prepared for it. A lot of people, I think, have binders for emergencies of what happens when perhaps a CEO has to do a unplanned healthcare procedure, or what happens if there is unfortunately, in the day we're living in, if there is an act of violence or some kind of terror activity. We have a lot of those plans. We don't have a lot of plans for some of the other things. And that's really where Foresight comes into play to be able to help us prepare for some of those eventualities.
So, to talk about work and the future of work, I think you've said most conversations are about the future of work and are really just about the future of the workplace. Can you share with us a little bit about what the difference is and why does it matter?
Yeah, so this is the brain shift for us right now. For the longest time, we knew how work happened. People would use a computer to work. They used their phones to have conversations or communicate. They met around a table to meet and collaborate. People gathered in a training room to learn. But that's not really how work happens right now. And what's happening today is that we're not realizing that the way that work is happening won't be what work looks like in the future. And what I'm seeing is that most conversations that are labeled as the future of work are actually conversations about furniture layouts or attendance policies. And it's trying to force people back into a container that doesn't act or function the way that it should because it was designed for processes that are outdated. So if you think about it, if we only redesign offices, we're solving the last problem. If we understand how work is changing, how decisions are going to be made, how trust will be formed and built, then we can design the workplace around those paradigms. So I'm going to give you an easy example of where I'm seeing this come into play right now. And it's around communication, which is really relevant in the workplace. So right now, I can communicate to a colleague on my phone or my wearable device by walking down the sidewalk. That can't happen in the same way in an office because our corridors aren't designed for that right now. Right now, we try to force people into a phone booth or a nook. But if we really look ahead, communication is almost becoming omnipresent, meaning it can happen anywhere and at any time. It can happen through a phone, a wearable, or really any kind of speech to device. And yet, we keep seeing the future of communication in an office not reflecting that. So if we need to design for that type of working condition, then the office follows that suit. And that's what I really mean of like people are trying to back end what the future of workplace looks like to what work used to be. And I personally don't understand why we haven't designed our corridors to be less about egress and more about the ways that we walk and work around our house per se.
Well, I got to imagine you're seeing a lot of things come into play in this period of time. I mean, work itself is changing dramatically. So I'm curious, what are you seeing? What are the patterns that you're beginning to see?
I mean, a lot of what we see is what you hear about. There are a lot of things that technology is changing. There are a lot of things that just personal preferences are changing. More people are wanting local connection. More people are wanting to be able to have flexibility. What I would also say is that human longevity is changing a lot of the ways that we need to be thinking about work too. So we're starting to live longer. We're starting to have second careers where people are coming back into the office. And we're starting to see an overlap where sometimes you've got a second career professional that might be, in their 40s or 50s that might be in the same role and position as someone who is just coming into the workplace in their early 20s. Most organizations right now are still planning their benefits or their environments as if work happens in these neat life phases of like early to mid to late career, but that structure doesn't really work anymore. So it's not just about technology, it's not just about preferences, it's about just the way that humanity is starting to evolve as well. And I don't think that we talk enough about that. I think we talk a lot about connection, which is right and what we should be focusing on. But we also need to think about the ways that all of these technologies, all of these changes are changing who we are as people and what it is that we could enable. And I think that's the part that I really wish workplaces focused more on is like what we could enable, not just what happens on day one. Because if you think about it, if you're just designing for the ribbon cutting or the photography or the first impression, what we're missing out on is the ways that design could help us evolve in an ongoing manner for year 3, for year 7, for year 10. And that really changes the paradigm of like what the workplace could become. It could become a long-term relationship with people, not just a static environment.
I'm thinking what you said about the workplace, where we look at it and it tends to be something that's static, but it's a tool. And, the technology that we use is also a tool.
Mhm.
So if I listen to you, what you're really pointing about, it's about how we as humans learn and interact and share ideas.
That is correct. And I think a lot of that is becoming more personalized. We're again in a time where hyper personalization is top of mind, especially for retailers, for, people wanting to have choice. The key here is that we can't let all of these new ways, technologies become like a grab bag. We really need to make sure that we're providing choice in a thoughtful manner. Because if you provide too much choice, people will just get overwhelmed and then they're just going to default to what it is that they already know. A lot of times the failure that I see with new designs and places and products is not because they didn't create something new and innovative, it's because they didn't socialize it well. When I talk about thinking ahead, a lot of times what we need to design for is the end state and the vision of where we could go. That in and of itself is a step that a lot of people aren't taking. The other step that they're not taking is that even if they have that end state in mind, they don't really think about the ways that we need to lead people to where we're going. Because if you design something that is so completely futuristic that may enable all the things that we really need, but you don't tell people how and why we got there, again, they're going to default to what it is that they know because their brains are just so overloaded right now. We're all so taxed for time, trying to figure out what we want to spend our time on, where we want to spend our time. So while all these things may help us accelerate some of the processes that are outdated, some of the workflows that we have, again, we need to be cognizant of giving people a set amount of choices, not just a plethora of any choice that they could possibly want.
I feel like it's a competition between change management and distraction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think change management, quite frankly, is an undersold service that I know a lot of firms are getting into. But quite frankly, I think that it's not just about socialization of space, it's about socialization of process, and I think the other big step that seems very scary and has perhaps some financial risk to organizations is really redesigning workflows. Because right now we're just trying to say, okay, you get this new workplace. Now do exactly what you were doing with these new tools in this new space, which may work. But if you've given me the new tools, why am I still doing the same workflow that I was doing when I was in the outdated space? That's the part that I feel like is another disconnect, that there's like this whole service about helping companies and organizations redesign their workflow as they're redesigning their space too. I think we talk about it. We do talk about how we're going to enable productivity, how we're going to enable collaboration, but we don't really manage that relationship in a right way.
Well, let me ask you, as organizations think about their physical work environment, I think that's exploded with all the different places that we can go to work now.
Mhm.
Where does, and just listening to all the things that you're talking about as I, try to put those together in my mind, where does a company begin when they start thinking about the next iteration of their workplace?
You know, Again, I think it comes down to what is the end vision that you have in mind. And when I say that, what I mean is not just what does the physical container look like, but what are the outcomes that you want to have and what are the relationships that you want to foster when the end product is created? And then how is that going to evolve over time? And again, I think if we think about the static of a lot of times organizations plan for 3 to 5 years. That's the average time frame that a lot of people focus on. when our places and spaces are built to last 10, 20, 50 years in and of itself. So we need to think about, yes, day one, but then that evolution. What I would also think about is, and when I say outcomes, what I mean is not just productivity, but how are we creating places and spaces that create a healthier workforce? How are we creating outcomes that people actually feel less stressed and we can measure that lessening of the anxiety that they may feel? And then how are we stewarding relationships through this space and product? And I think if you started with those kind of like attributes as a brief, as a design brief, versus just, I need a new space that maybe looks more modern and has the new tools, that would change some of the design paradigms and physical attributes that we would create.
Well, I think as a CEO thinking about their organization, there's going to be a vision that needs to be communicated. I think that they want to make sure the objectives are clear. I think
Hmm.
they want to attract the best talent to get to achieve those. I think innovation is going to be key. So how do ideas get exchanged? How does that collaboration support that? So, I think that, if I step back and look at that, I'm listening to you. It's really more about how do I create an environment that's going to support the types of interactions that are necessary in order to achieve those goals. Is that right? Or is there something different there that
I think that's right. What I would also say is the goals part is, I think, where that socialization comes into play. Often when I was working with companies and they would talk to me about work silos, you're like, we've got a great culture, but we've got a lot of different departments working in silos. And what I would say to them is, have you communicated the goals clearly and the vision of where you're going clearly? And sometimes they would say yes, and they'd point to, the vision document or the manifesto or whatever people would call it. But there would be a lot of like nebulous terms of like, we want to grow our company 10 years so that way we can expand and become a market leader that really brings innovation to the company. Those are all great words, but they don't actually have any weight behind them. And so I think if we want people to understand why we're creating these interactions and why we're creating these types of environments and the goals that we have, we need to make all of those ideas and vision more legible and what it means for each department and how each department is contributing. I think that's part of that missing link. When you get silos, it's because nobody knows where they're rowing. They're all trying to figure out like which path they're going just to do their mandate of what they know, but they often miss the part about how what you're doing over here actually has a knock-on effect and accelerates what's happening on the other side of the spectrum. So yes, I think we need to communicate all of that and the goals, and that comes in where that change management and socialization becomes truly critical for creating a successful workplace environment and culture in the future. And I think it also helps the outsider see the values of the company. If you think about attracting talent, what a lot of people are asking for is like, what are the values and what are you going to do for me? And it's that, what are you going to do for me? It's not just about salary. Yes, it's about money. We have to talk about money just a little bit, but it's like, what are the other tangible and intangible benefits that I'm going to get? And I think that's where, if we tie it back to those outcomes that we're going to create, you could have a potential employer say to a potential hire, if you work here, our workplace has actually been shown to reduce anxiety. And it does it by these three steps. And that goal that we had is because we wanted to make sure that our workplace wanted to come in. And so we've actually created this type of a space of here's how you use it. That type of a dialogue actually creates a relationship much faster. And we know that relationships are what bind us to the places that we work.
your research points to three forces: AI, connected devices, and synthetic biology that are shaping the next era. So, how do you see those converging in the workplace?
So, what I will say is much of this research and work came from some of my former colleagues at Future Today Strategy Group, which is the company that I worked for before I started at IIDA. And what they found is that these three technologies are converging to create a new technology supercycle that will change the ways that we work and live. Well, many people may not be familiar with that kind of terminology, so let me just explain that for a second. A super cycle is where you have an economic boom due to the rise of a new technology. And the internet is an example of a technology that created an economic super cycle. So if you think about it, when the internet was created and what it has done since it was created has completely revolutionized the way that we work and the way that a lot of us act and a lot of the way that we live. So, what the research was showing is that it's the same with AI, artificial intelligence, connected devices, which would be like your wearables, and synthetic biology, which is about like hacking DNA. And what's going to happen is they're going to have knock on effects that are going to accelerate change. So, for example, we're going to see AI that's going to augment like the ways that we think and work. It's going to help you to be able to summarize and make decisions faster. You're then going to have connected devices that are going to augment awareness about those decisions that are going to help our spaces and places know who's there and what's happening in those spaces as they make those decisions. And then synthetic body will augment the body, but it's also about increasingly the materials that are around the body. So think about it like this. In the future, if we do it right, and all these three things are in place, you could walk into a meeting room and it knows the type of work you're about to do. It knows that we need to adjust the lighting based off of the focus that you need. The air is going to change because it's going to sense like maybe when the CO2 is rising because the amount of screens that we're using. And then your wearable is going to give you nudges to have you move or get up and change positioning based on if you've been sitting there too long. And then all of those materials around you are going to be filtering out pollutants that will help you to work better and be healthier. They're going to have fabrics that could resist bacteria and even materials that can change thermal properties based off of the humidity in your room. All so that it's about comfort as we are working. A lot of like where we see this intersection happening. And quite frankly, some of it's already happening. A lot of those things are being piloted in ways right now where, especially if you think about lighting, the automatic sensing of lighting and the automatic sensing of like presence in our spaces. And so we're already starting to get into that future. We're just not experimenting enough, in my opinion. And I think if we start to take small bites of that, that's where we could see true innovation in the workplace that, again, moves beyond just like a new type of collaboration space or a new type of collision zone, something that truly elevates our practice and where people could actually see that, what we do as design practitioners has a measurable impact on your world beyond, again, just the container that you're sitting in.
So I imagine there's this convergence of that technology, the physical environment, and you talk about synthetic biology, and I'm thinking, okay, there's got to be a robot in there somewhere.
There definitely is. I think I would probably house the robots under those connected devices. And I think we will see more robots entering the workforce. They are already very present in our manufacturing and logistics facilities. There's many companies that use them for picking and pulling all of the stuff off the shelves in the warehouse. If you think about like the Amazons, people are working in and around robots all the time. I think what we honestly need to be thinking about for the workforce is how we work alongside technology, not just with technology, but how we see it as a truly activated partner. Because I think, in the workforce, we've got declining populations. We've got a lot of, workforce that is retiring. And we've got a lot of people that are just choosing to have a second career. And so I think we need to be thinking about the workforce not just as human, but also as, where are those robots and where are those connected devices, especially in the construction industry. Right now, a lot of the construction industry, I think the statistic is, if it's still correct, for every three people that are retiring, we only have one person to replace them. And that's going to slow our projects down if we're not careful, which is going to have financial ramifications, which is going to stall the industry. This is a lot of the challenge here comes down to risk and liability and regulation. And so I think if we want to try to figure out how to augment some of this, what I would recommend is thinking about where could we create use cases and pilots that give us measurable results that then help us to create regulation so that companies feel safe to use these devices, these robots in an ongoing manner versus just right now they're doing things like they're painting or they're laying brick or they're printing concrete, which are all really great tasks, but I think we could maybe edge a little bit further and have them work alongside us in a more cohesive manner.
We're gathering massive amounts of data in the buildings. We have sensors, wearables, digital twins. How do we prioritize that information and what really matters, as we begin to look out into the future?
I think it goes back to, again, that behavioral outcome data. Like, what is the outcome that we want to have? Right now, I think most of the data that we collect is about how much is this room used? Versus did it actually help us to learn faster? Did it help us to decide better? Did it help us to actually reduce stress? Frankly, I think utilization data is just such a small subset when that we overly rely on it. And when we do, it gives us perhaps false data. If you think about it, I see a lot of times where people are going into small conference rooms because they want to spread out. They've got a lot of paper or other devices that they need in order to do their work. So if we just look at utilization data, what that tells us is that we need more small conference rooms. When in actuality, it's not telling us the why behind people are using those spaces. So I think what we need to start collecting is more the why data, the on-body data of like how people are actually moving in around spaces and the reason behind what they're doing. The other thing that we could be collecting more of is the thing that you talked about, data for digital twins. So digital twins are the virtual replica of a physical space object, whatever. And it's used a lot in manufacturing. So they use it to monitor when a production line is going to go down. They use it to monitor if there are defects. They even use it to monitor the dock doors to figure out how many times the door is open and closed and when it might need to be replaced. And this is where those sensors, those connected devices are coming into play too. Because we have sensors everywhere. We have sensors going into walls, into floors, into the ceilings, into our HVAC systems. So we could be collecting data to help us to not operationalize, but to make our efficiency of our operations more knowable and more tangible. This could actually be a way that people get more comfortable with technology and devices in spaces and places when they see what the data is doing. So in a digital twin of an office, it could tell us, hey, you use this small conference room for X amount of hours for this type of work. Actually, if you were to maybe go and sit in this other area, the sunlight is better there, the airflow is better there, it might help you to be more productive. So if we use it as a tool versus just a tracking mechanism, I think that's where we might be able to leverage it in a way that feels more human and less big brothery right now.
So if you carry that forward and we look at what AI is doing for the profession, how is that going to change the process for workplace design?
I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? If we, think about it, let's start with the data. Let's start with what we know and like what I'm seeing research around. So right now, firms are creating their own AI based off of plans and programming and data, and they're using it to iterate faster than humans can. Firms are creating digital twins, again, those physical replicas or the virtual replicas of physical objects, to run simulations on workflow or even how long the space will last before it breaks down. And we know that designers are using AI for things like automating specifications and CDs. So those are the things that we know. They're collecting data to change those processes. What I want to call out and highlight there is that all of those examples are about AI changing the functional planning part of the process, not the creative part of it. So AI is going to compress timelines, absolutely, which is probably good news for our developer friends that are listening right now. But what is next is having the developers and the clients in the room with their AI talking to the firm's AI. And I think that's part of the design process that nobody's really figuring out because developers are collecting their data, designers are collecting their data, but we need to have all of those data meet in a meaningful manner. And I think that changes what the co-creation process could look like for when we need to have data to data talking to each other. So I hope that we can think about the process, again, less about using AI as a tool, but more as this agentic partner that helps us make decisions. And I think this is where the design process can evolve to now have more billable time to think about designing again for outcomes and the relationships in an ongoing manner. If we're automating the functional planning part of it, we should then be using that time that we gain back to be able to focus on some of the more meaningful aspects over time. Again, charting how human behavior and their connections to each other, to spaces and products and systems and ecologies could evolve over time.
So this whole process is going to get a lot more complex before it gets more simple.
I think it's about, well, yes, But that's a user experience, a UX and interface challenge. That's a design challenge that we need to figure out. It's interesting because in hospitals right now, a lot of them are integrating AI into patient rooms and exam rooms, I should say, where with patients' permission, they're using AI to monitor their voice. There's a lot of things that the voice can tell you about how healthy you are and maybe even what's wrong with you. The thing about it is that nobody's figured out what the right AI interface is and where it should sit in the exam room and how to make it feel more human. And I'm not saying we should anthropomorphize or make AI feel like a human or look like a human, but just how do we make it feel like that we can trust it? What does that interface look like? And then, yes, the complexity behind it we have to still solve for, but I think if we think about it more in terms of making it feel more human, more knowable, that's where some of that complexity, that some of that anxiety we may feel may actually be lessened.
I know you've studied immersive experiences. You talk about medicine and hospitality and education. Just curious, how would you carry that kind of an immersive experience into the workplace?
Well, it's not headsets and goggles, and it's not what Meta put out there. I highly doubt people really want a cartoon avatar to represent them. I mean, at least the ones that don't have any legs. When I think about where immersive can come into the workplace, I go back to that idea of like hyper personalization. And again, not about giving people too much choice. I don't want to have an abundance of choice. That's very overwhelming. What I want is I want people to have choice about what layers they're interacting with, especially as people are trying to navigate their day-to-day identity. And what I mean by that is that we all carry, I think it's around somewhere around 6 to 7 identities at any moment. I am a husband, I am a designer, I may be a parent, I may be a caregiver, I may be, a different ethnicity, I may be, and lots of different demographic identities that are playing into there as well. So we're navigating all those different identities. What I think could happen is that if we do immersive right, it's another layer that could help us to have our places and spaces recognize us. So that way we don't have to constantly reintroduce ourselves to a space every single time we walk into it. It again will just know that I'm here, here's the state that I'm in, and it will make it feel more comfortable to be in that state or whatever I'm in. It's about adding subtle layers onto the reality, the physical reality of the space. And I think this is where those wearable technologies and digital twins really create a way for people to step into a layered reality where you've got both the physical and the digital, but where you can also touch the digital. And I think that actually opens up opportunities for us to design new types of spaces. Right now, a lot of people are exploring how to touch physical objects in the immersive world. They're doing it for remote work in manufacturing, ironically. So, what they're trying to figure out is how can I have a remote worker who maybe not physically be able to come into the manufacturing or the warehouse area, be able to still move a box around or still move a product around? And I think if we think about that touch, we all crave that touch. That's a very human thing for us to want. So if we want the workplace of the future to have this immersive human component that blends that digital and physical, I think it's the touch part that we really want. Not just the, projected digital I step into it. And that touch can make it feel again more like it knows who I am. And I think, again, if we look at hospitals, you're already seeing this come into play because there are tons of immersive activations right now where they've got projected balloons where kids, families, whomever go up and they can actually pop the digital balloon as they're going in. That type of play allows us to have a new experience. It makes it something that we can, again, step into a shared experience as well. Because if you think about that, think about all the global offices that are out there right now. What they're trying to figure out is how to have cohesion office to office to office. And if I'm able to step into a digital physical interaction that I can touch that knows my identity, I get to share that with anybody around the world who might be stepping into that same environment with me. And we can create an interaction, we can create a shared moment, which I think is a really powerful aspect of the future workplace that we could dive into that again helps us to steward a new type of relationship and new type of connection.
I'm trying, as you're speaking, I'm trying to imagine what a space like that would be. I imagine that you've got projectors, sensors, touch screens, all these things, sound, maybe haptics.
Hmm.
all these things that are going to give us feedback that we need in order to process the information that we're trying to deal with.
I honestly feel like one of the places that we could start are wellness rooms. So, wellness rooms are being designed right now so that people can have choice of how they want to deal with whatever anxious moment or stressful situation they're finding themselves in. If we integrate technology, that can give us that feedback that allows us greater control. That's one area. I also feel like, to your point, what is this going to look like? It can't feel like a sterile environment, and it can't just feel like a white box that you're walking into that has a bunch of projectors into it. I think that would turn people off. I think what we need to do is thinking about, again, if I'm just walking around, what does it look like to have that immersive, that touch part, maybe on a corridor wall as I'm having a conversation with somebody? So maybe it feels like I'm walking down the corridor with somebody that is in a global office, halfway around the world. Or if we think about identity, what are the ways that we can signal that my identity has been recognized? Maybe there's a new type of light flickering that occurs that says, hey, your identity has been tracked. Not in a way that's, again, big brothery, but just like I recognize you in the moment. I also think about what are the ways that we can communicate without necessarily needing to talk that these immersive environments could help to facilitate. I wonder if we're seeing a lot about haptics, which is the being able to touch things and having technology react. What is it? What does a collaboration session look like around a conference table in the future where if I double tap the table, that's a signal to that table to do something for us? So again, I don't think it has to be this white box that has like all of this technology into it. I think that's part of me, maybe for design firms that maybe need to step into the spaces and products that they're creating. But I don't think that's going to work in an office. That's going to feel very cold and sterile. So again, it goes back to the vision of, is the vision that you want to create for an office that my global workforce community feels like they can be in contact and connect with each other at any single moment? That changes the paradigm. And then that tells us what technology we may want to integrate. Again, this is where socialization and change management comes into place because we need to communicate the goal and the why so that people feel comfortable using it.
Well, now you've got me thinking that we even need to include that kind of an experience in the design process itself.
Yep.
So, how do you think through that for a design firm that's beginning to think into the future? How do they look at the design process and how can they begin to integrate these technologies to create that more, immersive world that you're talking about?
So I think a lot of this comes back to foresight. And I'm not trying to say that in a very self serving manner. At IIDA and when I was at FTSG, we created the Certified Design Futurist program so that designers and firms could learn how to create almost a pre-experiencing phase of the design process, where what they're enabled to do is to create narratives about multiple different types of futures that the workplace could evolve, that then gives their clients the ability to choose which aspects of the future that they really want to activate on. And some of this should and can be done through a co-creation process with people, where what they're inviting people to do is to come in, they talk about the narratives, they talk about what are the opportunities and challenges through each future that they're exploring. And again, using that to build the programming, using that to say, what are the trade-offs that we may see if we do go with a more immersive technology that allows us to feel like we're connecting a corridor? That trade-off may mean that we might have to think about new types of acoustic solutions so that the corridors are more acoustically separated so that as people are having conversations, they're not disrupting the rest of the workforce. My main goal in really bringing foresight to the built environment, again, is going back to that relevancy conversation. You know, right now, AI, it can do a lot of things, but it can't do a lot of the context part that we bring to it. And so if I were a firm, what I would want to be thinking about is less about the linear process and more about kind of this ongoing feedback loop and pre-experiencing phases of work that help us to socialize a project. And I think that, again, if we use technology right, we get that time back to give ourselves time to think about those more heavier things like outcomes and relationships, and then future adaptability planning. I think a lot of the design briefs that are out there right now, because of the pandemic, are saying we need our future spaces to be flexible. They need to be able to adapt, no matter what conditions come out to play. And again, this is where foresight in that pre-experiencing phase would say, okay, not only the worker experience, but if we do have a black swan event, here's how the workplace would be able to transform. And I think the opportunity for us there is, again, modularity. I don't want us to constantly feel like we have to do a renovation project whenever something happens. I don't want us to constantly feel like we have to deconstruct something. I'd rather us figure out how we can reuse what's already there in a responsible, sustainable manner. So that way it doesn't feel like we constantly have to reinvest anytime we need to make a change. And so I think if we really think about future planning in a more responsible and near driven manner, that allows us to rethink the design process for, again, more of those ongoing feedback loops. It also provides new opportunities for revenue and business service models, because what that's asking us to do as design practitioners, as anybody in design firms, is to not just build a product again and then say, congratulations, here's your new space, but building an ongoing service relationship with that product. So that way you're constantly being involved with, what is the new update that need to be made? Here's the new behavior change that we're seeing. Here's how we plan for that behavior change. And then discussing it with clients of like, is this something you want to activate now? Or is this something that you just want to monitor and maybe say, here's what we want to plan for 3 years from now? So it really allows us to, again, reinvent not just the design process, but the relationship that we have with our clients.
I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for how we deal with the increasingly rapid change that we're faced with. And then, all of these things that we're talking about, I'm thinking that how do we begin to prioritize that so that we can understand where to put the energy and the time and the effort into a new work environment as we're thinking ahead with that? I'm wondering from your standpoint, how do you manage that rapid change and how do you prioritize those issues or those challenges?
I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but it does come down to the vision of what you want to do. I think we could maybe see some diversification of different types of workplace designers. Maybe we do have ones that are more focused on communication or on outcomes or on relationships. And those would become specialities that people could focus on that allows people to maybe renovate. I think, though, if we really stop and step back and say, what is it that we as a firm want to become known for? That then sets the stage for the vision of where we want to focus and what we want to prioritize. Because I agree with you. We can't do everything, nor should we. I mean, I think if we do, we're going to be limiting what the outcomes that we could create because we're so focused on all the possibilities. I think what I would hope to see is maybe workplace firms or workplace practitioners really start to center around, well, we specialize again in facilitating social cohesion. And that's really what we're good at. And the companies that really want to focus on social cohesion, they know who the expert is to go toward. And it's not saying they can't do the other things, but I feel like we have become a industry of mimicry over innovation, where we're constantly trying to do the yes and I can do that as well, versus I do this really, really, really well. And I think that is where a lot of firms are trying to figure out what their differentiator is. And again, I think if they started to think about those types of outcomes and things that they're going to be stewarding, that would tell them which technology to prioritize, which technologies they may want to invest in, maybe even which processes they want to reinvent. They may not need to reinvent the entire process. They may just need to reinvent a portion of it. They may just say, you know what, we're going to reinvent CDs because we want to accelerate that part of it, which will give us more time to think about the outcomes that we create. Again, there are trade-offs that these firms are going to need to make and decisions that they're going to need to make. And I think the prioritization comes from, what is it that we really want to become known for? What is it that we really want to do? And what challenges do we really want to solve for in an industry that is facing commoditization? I think that's part of the unspoken quiet part, that if we start to think about how we protect ourselves and how we retain our relevancy, it's not just by adopting everything. It's about specializing in the things that we really want to augment and to accelerate.
Well, I'm wondering, as you're talking about that, where's the value? Is it in the specialization
Mhm.
of some particular aspect of technology or workplace? Or is it in design and the problem solving aspect of it, where it's a more general approach? and then we bring in the experts, for each discipline that we need to involve.
I guess when you say value, do you mean value to the client, value to the business, or to the industry? Because I feel like those are three different tiers of value that we maybe dive into.
I think that what we're talking about here is this very rapidly expanding ecosystem
Hmm.
of all these new values and services and things that technology affords us. But in order to incorporate those into these very highly customized and personalized workplaces now, who do I go to first to begin this process? Do I go to somebody that says, okay, hey, I'm a specialist in robotics or, audiovisual systems or, mechanical systems? Or do I go to the generalist that says, okay, let's take the overarching look and we'll begin to figure out which pieces of this are going to be the priorities that we have to focus on?
I think the value is the latter, where we start maybe a little bit more with the generalist. And the reason that I say that is because I think the generalist is going to help you understand what you want to achieve. And I think the specialist is going to help you understand how to do it. And I think if you start with a specialist, what you're going to find is they're going to naturally gravitate toward what they know, which is not wrong, but it's what they're trained to do. I think what I would be doing right now is thinking through all of the specialists that I might need to have a contact for or to have ready to go. We at IIDA are starting to think about, do we have a list of consultants that people can pull from if they want to have a climatologist or an anthropologist on hand because of the project calls for that? They need those trusted resources. So I would start saying, again, figure out your end vision. And then this is a part of strategy. This is a strategy to figure out who I want to bring on board, what technology do I want to have ready. And then it's about solving the design challenge with those tools at the ready. And I think that's going to provide greater value versus just directly going to the specialist on hand. I think we still need the specialist, but I think we need to figure out again, what is it that we want to do first?
So then my next question is for designers out there and for, firms, what skills should workplace leaders be developing now to stay ahead?
Mm. Again, I want to say this in a non-self-serving manner, but I do think that we need foresight. I think that we need technology and data literacy. And then I think we need to be thinking about outcome-oriented design and how we develop those skill sets. So again, if foresight is not about prediction, we should be thinking about is a discipline of looking at the signals that are happening today and then asking better questions before the decisions are locked in and helping us to understand where we want to go. Obviously, we need technology and data literacy so that we can understand the tools that are shaping our industry and then deciding which ones we want to intentionally use and which ones we may not need. And then I think if we think about outcome and relationship delivery through design, it's about changing the idea and creating skill sets not around did we build the thing, but did the thing actually improve people's lives in a measurable way? And then how we can measure that. In other words, we need to be developing skills and people that can anticipate change, that can interpret the information, and then be able to translate that into measurable human impact. Again, because I do think that the most valuable part for professionals isn't just going to be the specialist, it's going to be the generalist and the translators that can move between those specialities, between the designs and the operations and the technologies and human behavior with a focus on the vision of and clarity of what they're trying to create.
So, what are the biggest blind spots that are out there that organizations need to worry about, when they start thinking about the future of work?
I think that right now, again, we're too short-sighted. I think that everybody is really focused on the 3 to 5 year when they're not planning for the 10-year shift or some of those big changes that will impact what the outcomes will be, how the workforce will shift. I think that, in an uncomfortable moment, a lot of people, again, default to what they know. So I think that there's a blind spot for not taking the moment to design, how they work or redesign how they work. Redesigning not all the workflows, but maybe some of the ones that have been around for too long that might need to shift. Figuring out which parts of their operating model could be augmented and not in a way to displace human staff, but augment what that human staff could be doing. And I think the blind spot of fear of technological replacement is also one that needs to be explored further. I think everybody just hears AI and they automatically go, it's the end of X, right? It's the end of workplaces, it's the end of marketing, it's the end of sales. And I think that kind of fear holds people back from really exploring and saying, okay, well, then what skills do I want to develop? What changes and processes do I want to invest in? I think the irony is that the organizations most worried about replacement are the least likely to invest in reskilling and actually increasing, and that actually increases their vulnerability. So I think that the trio is that we've got right now people who are focusing on short time horizons. We've got people that their processes are stalled. And I think that there's a fear of replacement. And I think that that's what's going to hold organizations back versus a lack of creativity and idea. I think that what you will find is that a lot of people have ideas and solutions, but they don't want to move forward because that uncertainty of all of those three things really holds them back.
So let me ask you, as you look out and you're studying all this stuff, is there something coming down the road that you see that is unique or exciting that we're going to include in the work environment?
So I just finished giving a presentation and I was talking a lot about relationship centered design. And I was talking about what relationship centered design could do, which I've talked about here and there if we focus on stewarding the relationships over time. And I think if we start to think about, again, those outcomes and relationships and stewarding those over time, if we get that right and we keep it, again, human and relationship centered, the workplaces and the built environment that we could create in the future stops just being a container. It stops just being a backdrop and it really starts to become a trust facilitator where these spaces can facilitate social cohesion and learning and well-being in measurable ways that connect people across life stages, across jobs, across global communities. And I think that if we also think about, again, the human part of it and the outcomes, that goes back to that human longevity. As we live and work longer, it means that our workplaces could support us across the continuum of how we're working and how we're living, not just for how we're working in that moment. I feel like what I want us to start getting toward is realizing that these places and spaces that we're creating can and should be thought of as almost like at a doctor level. Doctors provide very precise, very necessary care in the moment. And I think that's where we could see our workplaces and products and places moving toward. Again, if we start to ask ourselves some of these very tough questions, not in a way that's about, again, displacement or fear or trying to use the technology to solve it all, but as a way to help think about how we could actively contribute to human potential and social trust.
Well, I'm just thinking that if I distill this conversation down into a sentence or two, it's really about that human potential and our ability to interact with others, and really trying to optimize the environment to support that.
I agree. And it's something that we do. I just think we're in a moment to refresh our thinking about how we do it and what could become of the workplace.
We've covered a pretty broad spectrum of topics here. I'm just wondering, is there anything that we've left out that you think is important to include?
I think the only other thing that I would push, and I know this is probably going to maybe set some people on edge, is we don't just need to think about the workplace as a central location. I think if we think about the workplace as a central location and distributed, that opens up the possibility of helping people to feel like they're connected to their local neighborhood. One of the things that I talk about is that the pandemic really reset our social centers. We realized that a lot of where our social interactions occurred was in work. And again, I think it should, but we also want that to happen in our neighborhood. There was a study that just came out that I think it said 90% of adults in the United States need help forming connection in the local neighborhood around them. And I think that's, again, where the workplace could become that social connector, that trusted platform to do so. So it becomes less about having to work next to my coworker, but working next to my neighbor and getting to know my neighbor while we're both productive in the work setting that we're in. So I think that's the only thing that I would push out there is like, don't feel like, I know a lot of people have made financial commitments to creating those social centers. those social centers can and should be used, but it could also become a social center so that the neighborhood around where that workplace that you just made brings a bridge to others, so that we are bringing in the community and we're building local neighborhood connection as well.
Mark, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I've really enjoyed learning about your perspective. And I think it's really actually opened up my mind a little bit to think more expansively about the work environment, the human connections, and even our community. So thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation.
My pleasure. I just hope that hopefully, as you said, it sparks some ideas. I hope that people realize that there's lots of opportunities out there. While we're in a moment of change and perhaps fear, I still see tons of potential. And so I'm hoping that people find that in this conversation. And Bob, I just want to say thank you for allowing me the platform and the ability to have this conversation with you.
Well, this has been fun. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.